On today's program, former host Steve Owens talks about using rock in the landscape and shows us his new rock garden. Former host Brenda Sanders has some unique plants for the herb garden. Extension stormwater specialist Jason Vogel has an update on the sand cistern that we built by our green cottage. And we have gardening tips for July. Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance is provided by TLC, Oklahoma's leading garden center, Southwood Landscape and Nursery, Tulsa's source for great gardens, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing.
"19 years ago, when I was working here as studio garden manager, I had the great opportunity to construct the rock garden. It was a lot of fun back in those days putting this together, and it's a lot of fun now to come out and see how things are doing. Of course, rock gardening got its start in England back in the 18th century. The naturalistic style of garden design was becoming popular. Gardeners would be inspired by what they saw out in nature. They would try to recreate little wildflower meadows or maybe bubbling streams or water gardens, things like that. The more adventurous gardeners were those that had probably been hiking up in the Swiss Alps or some of the other rocky areas, and they wanted to create that rocky type of scenery in their own gardens. So they did this, and now all of our rock gardens today are the descendants of those first English mountaintop gardens. Well, I had so much fun putting this together all those years ago that I knew that when I had my own place, my own property, I would want to do my very own rock garden. And recently, I've had time to start working on that, and I'd like to show it to you. Here in the display gardens on my own property, I really like using rock. You can see I've used a lot of native sandstone to build the raised beds. And raised beds are awesome because it gives you the opportunity to create your own soil, and the plants do so much better. But I also really like the look you get with the plants and the rock together. Well, in the rock garden that I wanted to create, I was very fortunate in that there was some sandstone rock on the property. I was able to get in there, clear out some vegetation, rent some equipment, and go in there and collect the rock for my rock garden. Now, the rock garden at the Oklahoma Gardening Studio Garden is based on sort of a prairie rock outcrop, something that maybe you would see in the prairies out here in central or western Oklahoma. Some rock, some empty space for plants, and a little bit more rock and that kind of thing. When I set about to build my rock garden, I wanted to use a lot more rock. And also, the rock garden at Oklahoma Gardening is built on a slope. It's a beautiful setting. We were able to just kind of dig into the slope and place the boulders. Well, here I have no slope, so I brought in several loads of soil and I built up a mound, or sort of built my own mountain. And coupling that with using a lot of rock, I feel like I've really been able to build my own little mountaintop garden. Now, when you're constructing a rock garden, I think it's a good idea to use the biggest rock that you can manage. Rent the equipment, move the really large rocks into place, because it'll be more impressive. I think it'll look a little more realistic. And another really good thing is that you can use more types of plants. If you use really small rocks, you have to go really tiny with the plant material. Otherwise, the plants are going to grow up too large and they're going to cover up all the rock that you've worked so hard to get into place. Well, in moving our rocks, I rented a skid steer loader, one that could lift about 3,000 pounds, and a couple of these boulders that we put in place are pushing about 3,000 pounds. And when we put these in place, we made sure that we got these two side by side. If you look close, you can kind of see the channel between these rocks. This is the way they were sitting out in the wild. This was once one large boulder, and you can tell over time it kind of broke apart, and now it's two rocks. So we wanted to make sure we utilized both of those rocks where we could put them together like we did here. And we did want this garden to look somewhat natural, or at least an idealized natural sort of creation. So some of the rocks, we took photos, we made notes of the arrangement and just the way they were sitting out in the wild, and we brought those as a group and put those in the garden here, the exact arrangement that they were out in nature. And at certain angles, you look at some of these arrangements and it looks like one giant rock. Another thing you can do to make sure your rock garden looks natural is to be careful when you're moving the rocks. Not only to keep yourself safe and not harm your body, but also keep the rocks from getting scratched up and banged up. You don't want to use a front end loader to load them up and bang them around, because we don't want to scratch up the surface. We want to keep them looking natural. Any scratches or marks or dings or breaks in the rock will change the color, and it won't look consistent and it won't look quite as natural. So try not to scratch or scrape up your rock. I knew when I built the rock garden that I wanted to have a pathway going through it. A pathway I think is great because it lets you get up close and personal to some of the small plants and just experience the garden in a different way. And also having a pathway through a rock garden, it just in and of itself, it helps create little pockets for plants where the stepping stones or the changes in elevation of these rocks next to some of the big boulders just gives you these nice little pockets for planting plants in those little nooks and crannies. Now, when we put the pathway in place, we borrowed a technique that the Japanese garden design utilizes, and that is to place the stepping stones where their longest axis runs perpendicular to the pathway. For example, I've got two rectangular pieces of paper here, and the stones are laid out in this fashion, where this would be the line of the pathway with the longest axis running perpendicular to the path. The opposite of that would be to align the stepping stones like this. And in a pathway this way, it kind of gives you the idea that you should speed up and walk fast through the garden. Whereas if they're arranged in this fashion, it imparts the idea of walking slow through the garden and enjoying the garden a little bit more. Well, this garden is more about the rocks than it is about the plants. I want to make sure that any plant I put in here is not going to get too large. I've done a lot of work putting the rocks in place, and I don't want all of that to be covered up by the larger plants. Now, over the years, I will research different plants and try out new small perennials. I'll put in some small shrubs, maybe a few conifers and some bulbs to see what's going to work well in this garden. But in the meantime, I've kind of filled it up with a few annuals. We got some of the little dwarf Serenita angelonias. We've got some fanflower or scaevola, some zinnias, and a few other things. One of my favorite little annuals for the rock garden is this little yellow daisy right down here. This is the Dahlberg daisy. I love its bright yellow flowers and very delicate foliage. But these are annuals, and these will reseed themselves. We'll see them popping up in different places, and I just love the look they give you in the rock garden. Well, thank you so much for letting me show you my new rock garden. I hope in the future I have the opportunity to let you take a look at it again when we have a few more plants.
I'm Melanie Oliver. I'm an ambassador at the Botanic Garden at Oklahoma State, and I'm here to give you horticulture tips for July. Landscape tips for July include looking for signs of stress due to waterlogged soils. Root activity slows or shuts down, and plants show signs of drought. Decline in root growth slows plant growth processes. Leaves may wilt from lack of water uptake. Root rot is also common in some species. Lowering interior leaves may also yellow. Leaf scorch may also be a short-term water deficiency in leaves. Marginal burning, often from the top down, southwest side, or the side where root injury or root restrictions. Toward the end of the month, it will be time to divide and replant spring blooming perennials like iris, peonies, and daylilies if needed. Insect identification is important so you don't get rid of the good guys. Providing bird baths, shelter, and food will help turn your landscape into a backyard wildlife habitat. Water compost during extremely dry periods so that it remains active, and turn the pile to generate heat for proper sterilization.
Today we're here at the rainwater sound cistern here in the studio gardens, and we're here to kind of see how it's been doing since it was built on the show back in 2012. If you remember, we started this out by excavating a hole and putting a liner down at the bottom. The bottom part of that liner was filled with some tubing and some sand that would serve as our cistern that would hold the water that comes off of the roof and down into the rainwater sand cistern. Above that, we have some topsoil so that our vegetation will grow, and we had some sand columns to allow the water to go down into the system. Well, we've been utilizing this for a few years now, and what we found is that it holds water very well. As long as you keep using it, it's going to continue to be useful and to function. What we have found, however, is that although we designed it for 1,000 gallons, the most we've been able to get out of it at one time is about 400 gallons. That's because the capillary forces that occur down in that sand. Basically, just like you have water in a straw that has capillary attraction to it, the water that's down there in those sand particles wants to stay in the sand particles. So we could pump it at a very low rate, like what we would use for drip irrigation, and get about 400 gallons out of it. Let it sit for a day, and we could come back and get 200 or 300 gallons more out of it, and so on and so forth. But if we wanted to get all of that out of there at one time, we wouldn't be able to do that. So what we want to recommend now is that if you need to have something that you can get 1,000 gallons out of at one time, you need to oversize it to account for some of those forces that are holding that water within that sand. So if you're thinking about putting in a rainwater sand cistern, you might want to take some of those things into account. And if you'd like to build one for yourself, we have a YouTube playlist available online where you can learn how to put these together.
Tips for fruits and vegetables in July include make fall vegetable garden plantings in late July. Soak vegetable seeds overnight prior to planting. Once planted, cover them with compost to avoid the soil crusting. Mulch to keep the planting beds moist and provide shade during initial establishment. Monitor and control insect pests that prevent a good start of plants for your fall garden. Continue proactive insect application on fruit orchards. A good spray schedule is often abandoned too early. Follow directions on last application prior to harvest.
Well, here in Stillwater, they're in the process of completely renovating the herb garden and making it a lot larger than it used to be. And today I thought we'd talk about some of the a bit more unusual plants that they're putting in. And right here, we have this beautiful bed that's been planted very recently, and it's already mulched. It's got the pea gravel down, which is a great mulch for herbs because it helps keep the soil kind of warm. It doesn't trap in quite as much moisture. And they've planted several plantings here of Cuban oregano. Now, this is Cuban oregano, and if you compare it, I brought an actual oregano plant that you usually see to cook with. This is an oregonium here. and has that classic, we think of it as an Italian food smell, but it's actually used in several different types of food. And if you smell this Cuban oregano, it smells very similar. Depending on how you grow it, if it's got a little bit more sun or maybe a little bit more fertilizer, it might have a little bit different scent to it. But if you compare the plants, if we look at them, you notice that the leaves of the oregano that we usually think about are very thin, while the leaves of the Cuban oregano are actually very thick and fleshy. And they're also very fuzzy. And this plant is actually a tropical plant, which that means that it is not going to overwinter for us, even though it is a perennial plant. It's tropical, and we do not live in a tropical environment as much as we think so this summer. But it really doesn't like temperatures below 40 degrees. So where you can leave this oregano in the ground all winter, you're going to need to take this oregano and take it inside. The neat thing about that is it's actually more closely related to a common houseplant that we have, a plectranthus, also coleus. So it lends itself very well to taking cuttings and bringing inside. And while we have it planted out in full sun here in the herb garden, it actually can take a bit lower light levels, so it does very well in the window over the winter. And you see, you can just take a cutting, just have your top whorl. If you took this cutting, you would take about 3 inches off, remove all of these leaves down here. I'm just going to go ahead and break them off like that. You'd cut that and then just stick that down in some moist soil. It will root very quickly and you'll have this all winter. And the other thing about it is that while this works well in dishes that you would use common oregano in, it doesn't lend itself that well to drying because of the thick fleshy leaves. You may run into it molding before you get it dried. So it works a little bit better if you use it fresh. And the other thing is you would want to experiment with it and not just sub it out completely for, say your recipe called for a teaspoon of oregano. You may not want to use a teaspoon of this right away. You might want to just kind of experiment with it. It tends to have, if you put too much in, more of a turpentine flavor to it. So while it does work well, it smells wonderful. It's wonderful for a scented garden. It's not a one-to-one substitution. Now we've got another more unusual herb here. And again, this is a tropical, so we've got it planted out here for the summer. However, if you wanted to plant it in your garden, you might even think about planting it in a pot. This is lemongrass, and it does have that beautiful lemony smell. And you don't smell it so much when you rub the leaf, but if you break the leaf and smell it, you get that, oh, this is great lemony smell. Now this plant, again, likes full sun. It needs to be planted in a well-drained area. And where we didn't really, I don't know if I mentioned it, but the Cuban oregano, we didn't want to fertilize it very much. This plant really likes fertilizer. And so if you put some composted manure in with it when you plant it, it will love you. And also if you come along every couple of weeks or so, give it a little bit of liquid fertilizer, it will also do a lot better because it's a heavy feeder, it's a grass, and it's growing a lot. So it actually likes to have fertilizer. Now, when you go to harvest the lemongrass, the part that you actually use, while you can cut off the leaves and infuse those to make a lemony tasting water or broth, the part that you actually use, and we're going to move over here and take a look, is the base of the lemongrass. And the way you know it's ready to harvest, really, if you look here at the bases of the stems, they're kind of small, but look over here and we've got one that's approaching about 1/2 inch. And that's about where you would want to harvest it. And when you go to harvest it, you're going to want to cut it down. If you follow the stem down, it gets kind of bulbous down here. And you just want to cut it right below that bulbous part. You know, kind of like a green onion. It gets a little bigger at the bottom. You're going to cut it right there. Here we go. And I even got some of the roots here. So you're going to cut that. And also, this is a good way to take it in. Remember, I said it's tropical. It's not going to make it through the winter here. You could take a piece like this, put it in a glass of water. It will root, and then you can keep that inside for the winter. But when you go to use this, if I'm going to cook with it instead of just root it, you just remove these outer leaves here till you get down, kind of see. That's kind of like a green onion too, where you remove the outer leaves. And then the part that you're going to use to cook with is this piece right in here that's white. And you can use that in different dishes. I know Thai cooking uses lemongrass a lot, and that's very good. When you bring it in for the winter, whether you bring it in a pot, which you can do, put it in a sunny window. This one might take up a little bit too much room. While it likes water, well drained, but don't let it dry out during the summer, you actually want to keep it no fertilizer and not much water over the winter. And you're going to cut, if you bring it in and even if you root it, you're going to cut your leaves down so you don't have all this extra, and kind of bring it in like this, either in a pot or rooting or whatever, over the winter, and you almost kind of ignore it, and it will do a lot better. If you overwater it over the winter, it's probably going to rot on you. Now the last plant that we're going to talk about is kind of a variation on basil. Well, it is a variation on basil. This is variegated basil, and that's what's fun about having a whole lot of room in your herb garden, is you can start branching out and planting more unusual plants that you can use, you know, for decoration as well as in your cooking. But I just wanted to show you here the difference. This is just your standard sweet basil, and this is the variegated basil, which actually variegation is a technical term for the way the plant fails to have any chlorophyll in its cells, and so it ends up being white, sometimes yellow, and sometimes it'll be different colors because it has other cells that mask the green. But this one actually just lacks chlorophyll. So you notice one thing right away that happens with variegated plants. The leaves tend to be smaller than a plant that has all of its chlorophyll because it doesn't manufacture as much food for the plant. So they tend to be a little bit more stunted. The nice thing about this variegated basil, while you can use it to cook with and all, you know how regular basil, it's an annual, you know, it isn't a perennial. It isn't going to come back every year, and it wouldn't here anyway because it's, again, it likes a warmer temperature. But the other thing about it is once basil starts to set flower and then seed, you notice how it basically starts to die because it's done its job. It's an annual, it's set its seed, it's going to let the seed disperse. There's no reason for the plant to stick around, so it starts to die. That's why when you have regular basil, you want to keep the blooms off so you can keep getting your basil leaves all summer. Well, with the variegated basil, it really doesn't bloom. So you don't have that problem with it wanting to go dormant on you when you forget to harvest. So that's actually kind of nice. And while it doesn't have maybe as much basil flavor as your workhorse here, your sweet basil, it does lend a nice addition to basil dishes that you might have. And again, you could bring it in over the winter, bring a cutting in, put it in the windowsill and have a little bit to use when you don't have it all growing out in your garden. So anyway, these are just a few of the more unusual herb plants that they're able to add because they've expanded the herb garden here so much.
Turf tips for July. Sharpen or replace mower blades as needed. Shredded leaf blades are an invitation to disease and allow more stress on the grass. Mowing heights for cool season turf should be at 3 inches during hot, dry summer months. Gradually raise mower height of Bermuda grass lawns from 1.5 inches to 2 inches. Vegetative establishment of warm season grasses should be completed by the end of July to ensure the least risk of winter kill. Brown patch disease of cool season grasses can be a problem. Fertilization of warm season grasses can continue if water is present for growth. Those are your horticulture tips for July. Please come join us at the Botanic Gardens the first and third Saturdays of the month through the fall.
Next week, Extension entomologist Jackie Lee helps us monitor a new threat to Oklahoma fruits. Extension entomologist Eric Rebeck identifies what's causing the folded leaves on our redbuds. Former host Ray Campbell gets us out in the heat to check on our garden. And Barbara Brown has a school lunch recipe that's better than recess. So join us then for more TV You'll Grow to Love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, TLC Garden Centers, Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.